From WRAL News, this is How to Commit Journalism, part of the Capital Broadcasting Podcast Network. Each week, we bring you the backstory behind the big story to take you inside our journalistic process. I'm Enterprise Executive Producer with WRAL News, Ashley Talley. Today's podcast is a conversation with reporter Sarah Krueger, who has covered Confederate monuments and the debate around them in our local area for the whole time that she has been our Durham reporter at WRAL. Since we recorded this, things have continued to happen in the Silent Sam case at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and they'll continue to happen. We want to give you the background on how Sarah's coverage has gone and evolved over time, but also update you that just last week, the judge in the case ruled that the deal that was announced just before Thanksgiving to give the Silent Sam statue to the Sons of Confederate Veterans is now overturned. There's uncertainty about where that statue is and what happens to it moving forward, along with the millions of dollars that the university gave to that organization. But right now, we're going to take you back to the beginning. Sarah, where did your coverage of this story begin? I'm sure it's been going on since you've been here.
Yes, it began years ago. So in 2017, my first out-of-state assignment for WRAL was going to Charlottesville to cover the Unite the Right rally.
Oh, wow.
And so it began there, and I remember driving back into Durham after a weekend there covering that, and seeing a road blocked off in downtown Durham, seeing Main Street blocked off, and a lot of protesters. And little did I know at that exact moment that that was just minutes before the Confederate statue in Durham was to be torn down. So I was not physically there for that statue being torn down. Of course, we had another crew there, but that was, August 2017. And so I was right by that one. And then August 2018, I was there when Silent Sam was torn down on UNC's campus. And I've also been covering the Chatham County Confederate Monument and then a number of other issues related to those monuments. And just as recently as this week, covering a large Confederate flag that's flying in Orange County that is also the topic of debate now. So it's been a topic that I have been immersed in since at least 2017.
And what we're seeing is those, for the most part, are coming down, right? Silent Sam, last night the flag was told it didn't meet zoning regulations, right? Is that
right?
Do you see that as the overall movement that these monuments are going away? I know it's a difficult process to get there, but
I think so. And I think what has interested me also is to see the varying ways in which different counties and cities are approaching these issues. So most notably in Durham, which was the first one, that statue was torn down by protesters. And unlike some of the other places, really there was no movement that I'm aware of or that we covered to bring the statue back. Mm-hmm. That statue was torn down, and really I've heard very little discussion since then. There was a committee, a task force that met for a number of months and developed a plan or suggested a plan for what to do with the monument. But I was just thinking about that this morning that, I think they suggested leaving it crumpled up and putting it inside the old courthouse that it used to stand outside of. Mm-hmm. But there has been no movement, as far as I know, to enact that plan. Mm-hmm. So that's the Confederate monument that went away the most quietly, from what I can tell.
That's interesting. Where is it kept now? Do we know?
I think it's in a county storage facility was the most that we were able to get. As with all of these Confederate monuments, they do not like to say exactly where they're being kept, but that one I believe is in a storage facility, as is the Chatham County Monument, which is in a storage facility in Greensboro.
Got you.
But even just, watching the legal arguments that each county or entity has made to, either keep the statue down or not put it back up, they've taken some different routes, and that's been interesting to follow as well.
Yeah, well, let's go through that with one of them. And I think the most recent developments, especially legal, have been with Silent Sam. That was on the Chapel Hill, UNC-Chapel Hill campus for, when was it erected? Do you know? Late 1800s?
It was erected in 1913.
Okay. And who is Silent Sam? I found that a lot of people don't really know that.
Right. So Silent Sam was erected in 1913 at McCorkle Place at UNC. And Julian Carr, who is a white supremacist whose name has been on, many things in our area, some of which have been removed, was the one who gave the dedication speech to erect Silent Sam. And in that dedication speech, he made a number of inflammatory, racist comments.
Including something about beating a black woman or something? Wasn't that
beating a black woman until her skirt hung in shreds.
Mm.
And that dedication speech was lost, actually, for some time, or was not, at least in the public eye, until just recently. I mean, several years ago, maybe, that a graduate student rediscovered it and brought that back to the surface. And, that's been something that activists have used to demonstrate the intention of the statue, right, arguing that the dedication speech demonstrates that it was meant to be an intimidation. Mm-hmm. But the Silent Sam itself broadly represents a boy soldier, or, young man Confederate soldier. A lot of UNC students went to fight for the Confederacy, and he was modeled after them.
Got you. One quick question about Julian Carr. Is Carborough named for him?
It is, yes.
Interesting.
And there was some discussion briefly from Carborough officials about whether they should rename the town of Carborough, but ultimately they decided against it and said that now they feel that the name Carborough signifies,
means something else.
Progressive values.
Right.
They, felt that it would also be expensive to change the name of a whole town and all that would entail.
Right. So when did the movement to bring Silent Sam, to take the statue down or to remove it from campus, when did that start, as far as you know?
I know it started well before I began reporting here in 2016, so I'm not sure exactly. But I do know that during my time here, starting in 2016 and then until 2018 when it was torn down, the movement to bring Silent Sam down certainly intensified.
Mm-hmm. And ramping up or kind of culminating at the moment that it's toppled.
Yes, and I will forever remember that night. That was a very long night. I think I got to work at my usual time, so 9 a.m, and we were aware that there was going to be some kind of a protest regarding Silent Sam.
And when was this?
A number of protests. That was August 2018, okay. I believe August 20th, either the 19th or the 20th.
Okay.
I had just gone back from vacation, and that was my first day back. And, we had covered a number of protests, but it was pretty clear from the time that protest started that something was different. And so we knew we needed to stay out there. And it ended up being, a long night of both protests and celebrations from many people once the statue was torn down. Just euphoria from a lot of people who were out on the quad that night.
Were there people protesting the protesters? Were there, Sons of Confederate Veterans representatives?
There were some. I mean, the pro-statue supporters were far outnumbered, but there were a few of them who were there.
And was it mostly students or community members involved in bringing it down?
Yeah, so that's been a question from a lot of people since this happened. And there were definitely some students involved. And from my conversations with them, I know they resent the suggestion that this was a group of, quote, outside agitators who tore the statue down, because that is what some tried to argue after the statue was brought down.
Minimizing the movement.
Right. So students want to make it clear, that they were out there and that they were involved in this. And I remember, I think more than a dozen people were charged that night. And there were at least a few students among those charged.
Coming up after the break, Sarah talks about the surprising news that came the day before Thanksgiving about who now owns Silent Sam. Fast forward to most recently, last week and the week before, the week of Thanksgiving, some developments happened, specifically the day before Thanksgiving. Tell us, update us on what happened.
We found out that Silent Sam had been given to the Sons of Confederate Veterans, along with a $2.5 million fund that UNC would give to the Sons of Confederate Veterans, starting a trust fund to care for the monument. And this just took us all by surprise, because my first question was, wait, I didn't know there was a lawsuit. All of a sudden, we're hearing about a settlement of a lawsuit, getting a press release from the UNC system, and we're all wondering, wait, when was the lawsuit filed? So I rushed over to the Orange County Courthouse and pulled all of the documentation. It was hundreds of pages, and I was trying to go through it as quickly as possible. It was about 2:00 at that point, and I had to do a live report on TV at 4.
Mm-hmm.
So I was rushing through to get as many facts as I could. But now that has been the source of immense controversy with, no end in sight at this moment.
Because the lawsuit was technically filed after the settlement was reached. Is that correct?
Exactly, yes. And the $2.5 million payout to the Sons of Confederate Veterans has not been received well by UNC students, by UNC faculty,
mm-hmm.
by many UNC alumni. I was at the UNC Faculty Council meeting just a few days ago, where Interim Chancellor Kevin Guskiewicz took a number of questions from faculty members, and they are incredibly angry about this and say that the payout goes against the university's core values.
Mm-hmm.
And they called on the Interim Chancellor to condemn the payout, and really he would not.
Well, and he sent an email, like a press release out that sort of, I felt like he was foisting the blame on the Board of Governors.
Right. Yes. And that's something he reiterated in that faculty council meeting a number of times. He said that this decision was made by the Board of Governors, and it was not approved by the Board of Trustees. It was not approved by him. And he stopped short of saying that he was completely unaware of what was happening, but he definitely said that, this was not his plan.
So this seems to have been, I was going to say orchestrated, but it's not orchestrated. It seems to have been worked on by the Board of Governors, specifically with the Sons of the Confederate Veterans or their attorneys. Is that right?
Exactly. Yes. And, ever since the monument was brought down, of course, the immediate question from university officials was, what are we going to do with it?
Right.
And there have been a number of ways and committees that were trying to, decide what to do with it, including former UNC-Chapel Hill Chancellor Carol Folt. She and the Board of Trustees developed a plan and presented it, and that plan included building a multi-million-dollar center on campus,
mm-hmm.
on a corner of campus, and housing Silent Sam there. And that plan was immediately shot down by the Board of Governors. Then the Board of Governors put together its own committee to decide the future of Silent Sam. And they kept kicking the can. There were dates that they were supposed to, present their ideas, and those kept getting delayed.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally that was just delayed indefinitely. And, I kept asking questions about, when are you going to tell us what, where do you stand? And I now realize, it's quite possible that by that point already they were thinking about the Sons of Confederate Veterans and thinking about giving the statue to them. So
there's so much to talk about with this story. But one thing I want to go to is that, so the UDC is who erected the statue back in 1913, but at some point, ownership of it was transferred to the Sons of the Confederate Veterans. Is that right?
Right. That is what we learned from some of the court documents just a couple weeks ago.
And so if the Sons of Confederate Veterans own the statue, why is the university paying anything?
That is a great question. That is a key question. And I don't know, because the Sons of Confederate Veterans and the UNC system have really not been open to taking our questions. So I don't know if the SCV is claiming, some kind of damages, or I don't know if, they're claiming that they need that money to re-erect the statue. I don't know if, that would be part of the expense. I am really not sure. And I've been trying so hard to get answers to questions. I've filed a number of public records requests. So I think that may be where I ultimately am able to finally get this information, but I'm not sure when that will be.
Yeah. To get these actual documents, if they exist. Like you said, we've called Kevin Stone as the local chair, right, of the SCV.
Yes,
and
the
commander, excuse me. I've talked to him and he was like, no comment, no comment, no comment. I'm sure you've reached out to him many times. There was a whole other thing of this potential email that he may have sent out to other members, but we won't go into all that. But why do you think, and I don't, I'm not asking you to predict the future, but why do you think they're being so reticent about it?
Yeah, I think a part of it is that the Sons of Confederate Veterans want to keep their plan close to their vest about where they're going to put Silent Sam's. And I know there have been a number of people speculating on social media about where it might go. The settlement said that it cannot go in any county in which the UNC system has a school.
That's interesting.
So, it will not go back in Orange County, but there have been some speculating that it might go to Tennessee, to a center that the Sons of Confederate Veterans are working on there. But really, others have said that the Sons of Confederate Veterans might use this $2.5 million to build a North Carolina headquarters and put the statue there. But I think the SCV, has got to be getting a lot of angry emails and phone calls, and I think they're trying to lay low to the extent that is possible.
Let things quiet down before making any moves. Coming up after the break, Sarah talks about the difficulties of covering complex issues day in and day out. This is a complicated issue to cover. I mean, you have people that are very passionate on both sides, I would expect. We're over 150 years past the Civil War, yet these things are now, becoming more talked about and more front of mind. What questions do you have to ask yourself, and decisions do you have to make with management here at WRAL when you talk about, how you're going to cover these events? What are some of the complications you deal with?
Well, I think one thing definitely is that there have been some hate groups identified by, the ACLU as hate groups who have been adding their voice to this conversation as far as in support of the statue. And certainly we do not ever want to give a platform to hate groups or to hateful rhetoric.
Right.
And that has been, something I have been very aware of at all of these stories. I think also there are some people on this issue who will say things that are just simply not true about, history or historical perspective. And it can be difficult because it appears that there are people who truly ascribe to these false ideas. And, we do not want to be in the business of spreading false information. So I think it's just having to have a constant awareness and fact-checking sense, that reporters always have, but it's definitely heightened when you go into these situations, and there's just an extra level of caution because this is such a divisive issue, and so much tension over this issue that has not subsided. Even the night Silent Sam was brought down, it seems to me that the amount of passion remains the same even today.
Interesting. So it wasn't like that was a peak. It's like it's gone that high and stayed there.
Right, exactly.
On both sides of the issue, I would imagine.
Mm-hmm.
Again, there's so much we could talk about here. I think that the SCV and other groups like that claim heritage, not hate, and these sort of arguments. But it's complicated. And you went to college in Durham, right? You went to Duke?
I did, yes.
So what's your sense of the community there as far as cohesive when it comes to, obviously the city, like all in the South, was once very segregated. Do you feel like it's more of are people working together more there, do you think?
One thing that has been interesting is, these 3 Confederate monuments that I've spent a lot of time covering have been in Durham, in Chapel Hill, and in Pittsboro. All places that, have reputations for being progressive and quite liberal.
Right.
And I mean, that may be part of the reason why the statues in those places have been removed.
Right.
But it's also, been interesting to watch. I mean, at least definitely in Pittsboro, many of the protesters who came out in support of the statue, and there have been protests, for months, every weekend, have come in from out of state. And that is something that people who live in Pittsboro, want to make sure that others understand. And from my conversations with Pittsboro locals, they say, these people who are coming to protest, for the most part, they are not our neighbors. These people are driving in to make our local issue their issue. And, they feel that the majority of people in Pittsboro would support the removal of that monument.
That's interesting. That's much like Charlottesville, right? Where the groups that met there were not, for the most part, Charlottesville nor Virginia natives even.
Right, exactly. And then, I talked earlier about how in Durham, I think that Confederate statue went the most quietly. And I think that's definitely indicative of Durham's population as, being a very liberal place. There are not many vocal dissenters here or many vocal supporters of Confederate monuments compared to some of the other locations.
Interesting. I know that you will continue to cover this issue, and it's not something we haven't wiped our hands and, okay, everything's good to go. So many more questions arise. What do you anticipate being the next sort of iteration of this story? Getting those answers maybe from the public requests that you put in?
Yeah, I'm sure once I get those public records, I will have just as many questions as answers.
True.
But I think something, that still needs to be addressed going forward is just the future of that 2015 monuments law that has come into play in all of these cases, or at least in most of them. That 2015 monument law that dictates what you can do with monuments that are on public property.
And what does it say? I'm not familiar with it.
My recollection is it says that you can't remove a monument that's on public property.
Limitations of removal. An object of remembrance located on public property may not be permanently removed and may only be relocated, whether temporarily or permanently, under the circumstances listed. Interesting. That complicates things even further.
Right. Yeah. So that 2015 monument law, I think, will be one of the next things to be addressed, because the 2015 state law essentially says you cannot remove monuments that are on public property. But there have been a number of legal scholars and experts who have poked holes in that and found ways around that. And so now, I'll be curious to watch what does happen with that state law, and if lawmakers will try to rewrite it, to solidify it, or if it might just go by the wayside entirely.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for talking to us about this complicated issue, and we know that you'll continue to cover it for WRAL. For other shows in the Capital Broadcasting Podcast Network, search podcast on WRAL.com.